Hey everybody, just a quick note before we start. I have a new podcast. I'll keep working on the On Books podcast, so if you like the On Books podcast, please subscribe and look forward to future episodes. But I also have a podcast now that has just launched called the Learn to Code podcast, and I just want to tell you briefly about it. Learn to Code, and the reason I'm excited about it is because it's giving me an opportunity to chat with a lot of my friends and my students who I've seen learn to code and get amazing careers, really just upskill and just do some amazing things with coding and with technology. And the reason I like it is because it's the stories that we're going to cover are not always developer stories. It's people who are learning to code who are MBAs, some of my MBA students. It's people who are learning to code who are product managers, data journalists. I have a friend who, it's an amazing story, which I'll share, who he is using Python code to basically help pass legislation to stop sex trafficking. So there's so many different uses of coding and technology that people are using out there. And I'm just so excited to share some of these stories. So if you're interested in hearing the Learn to Code podcast, you can just search for it in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or by going to my website, onemonth.com, and clicking on the blog, where you'll see all the transcripts and links and all the stuff from the podcast. So that's the Learn to Code podcast. I'll also have some short episodes where you can learn the basics of coding yourself if you're interested in learning just some of the beginner digital literacy language that I teach in my course at Columbia. So all of that and more on the Learn to Code podcast. Check it out if you want to hear more. There's a ton of episodes coming live in the next few weeks. And other than that, I hope you enjoy this episode of On Books. So thanks for listening, and I'll kick it over to the other version of Chris, who is starting the episode right now. Hello, and welcome to the On Books podcast. This week on the show, Mark Katakowski and Stephen Clausnitzer of ForeverLabs will be joining me to talk about stem cell research and the one book that really influenced them to thinking differently and more progressively about aging. In this episode, we'll talk about ForeverLabs. What is ForeverLabs? And if you don't know, in short, ForeverLabs is a stem cell research company. You can get your stem cells banked and saved to help fight age-related diseases later in your life. We'll be talking more about that, how they got started, and some of the books and education around aging if you are curious to dive in and learn more. I was curious, and well, I had the procedure done myself only 2 weeks ago. And so I was talking with the founders and thought, wow, this would be some really interesting information to share with the On Books audience, again, as well as some of the books and resources out there for learning more about this topic, to which I had a hard time educating myself on to begin with. So we will hear it from them directly, all about ForeverLabs, stem cells, and the related education that's available so that you can get informed. Okay, so without any further ado, here we have my chat with Mark Katakowski and Stephen Clausnitzer of ForeverLabs. How's it going, guys?
Great, well, great, Chris.
Hey, I'd be curious. I mean, let's just start off. Maybe people listening don't know about ForeverLabs. Like, what is ForeverLabs?
Sure. So at ForeverLabs, we'll store your stem cells so you can live healthier longer. And the reason that matters is as you age, you lose these cells, and the ones that remain become damaged and less effective. And that decrease in number and function accelerates with age. So the longer you kick that can, you said a year, the longer you kick that can, the faster the decline is occurring. So it's important stuff. There are over 700 clinical trials using these cells to treat various age-related diseases like cardiovascular disease and stroke and osteoarthritis, et cetera. The problem is once you need those cells to treat yourself and you're aged, they're no longer as effective as they would have been if you banked them when you were younger. So that's what we do and why we do it. Mark, you want to add to that?
Sure. I'd just like to say that in a nutshell, the very simple value proposition is as you get older, your cells do. I mean, that's the reason you grow older, is that your cells actually age. It's not just, some kind of macro thing. It actually starts at the cellular level. But you can actually take youth and you can preserve it to be used later in life. And we do that by cryopreservation. And I guess expanding on it. So I started, this all kind of started in 2001 when I started doing my PhD research in Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, Michigan. And we started using these stem cells that we bank for the treatment of stroke in mice and rats. And we found they're very efficacious. But then over the next 15 years of developing these therapies in the lab, we became acutely aware that they degrade. The cells actually degrade in therapeutic quality as the animals get older, and the same thing happens in humans. And so about 3 years ago, 4 years ago now, I think, Steve and I were almost, because my birthday's next week, Steve and I were on a call, and we worked together on a few projects for almost a decade and a half at that too. And I said to Steve, I was like, hey, I want to bank my stem cells. I'm turning 40 and I want to bank my stem cells. And he was like, well, what are you talking about? And then that's where it started. After just telling him why, Steve was like, well, that sounds like something I'd like to do. And that's where the whole kind of ForeverLabs came from.
Wow. So you had seen stem cell banking work because you were working on these, I guess, projects in the lab. And so this was something that was proven already before you decided, hey, I want to make my stem cells.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is something that, firsthand, I learned the difference between young and old cells because I was using them, both, mice and rat, but also human cells, to develop therapies using them for mostly neurology, like stroke and brain injury and things like that. And I learned firsthand that these cells were degrading with age and losing their therapeutic efficacy. And it's pretty, I was like, wait a minute. Like we do cord blood banking for, when kids are born. Now it's fairly popular that there's stem cells in the umbilical cord blood, and companies offer the ability to cryopreserve them to kind of retain those youthful, valuable cells. I was like, why aren't we doing this for everybody? That's where it kind of came from.
Did you?
I actually,
yeah.
Okay.
I was going to say, did you find it was possible to get your stem cells banked? Were there people offering it for?
No. So we got off that phone call, and he really mentioned this out of nowhere. The conversation had nothing to do with us trying to start a company or anything like that. And we left the call sort of committed to the fact that we wanted to get these cells out of us. And so one of the steps I took was to reach out to a friend of ours named Dr. Laith Farjo. He's a orthopedic surgeon trained at Michigan, fantastic guy, and asked him about whether or not he'd be willing to take out our bone marrow. And it turns out that orthopedic surgeons and sports medicine doctors all across the country were already doing this. What they do is they take out someone's bone marrow, they concentrate the mononuclear cells right at the point of care, and they introduce it into the injury area. So let's say you have a bad knee, they'll take out your bone marrow, concentrate the cells, introduce it into your knee. This was happening all over the U.S. Phenomenal physicians everywhere doing it, but nobody was banking the cells. So once he told me that, Dr. Farjo, that's when the light bulb sort of went off. And I realized, well, there's this infrastructure that exists, but nobody's sort of taking advantage of it to store these cells so you can have access to it later in life. And Dr. Farjo, by the way, joined us and is our chief medical officer now. And that's when ForeverLabs was really born, is when we did that. I always say the company was born out of our own midlife crisis. Like Mark and I were both about to turn 40, and we're like, we wanted to store our stem cells. To answer your question, no one out there was doing it and was willing to do it. So we started the company ourselves.
Oh, that's so fascinating. But you said that they were doing it for kids. This is and this is something that I came up with. People would say, hey, they asked you just had a newborn child. Can we bank is it stem cells? Is it the same process that they're doing?
It's way different. So with that, it's essentially the same materials in the sense that you end up with mesenchymal stem cells, and you have your cells, these babies' cells available to them for the rest of their lives. It's phenomenal. So if anyone out there listening is pregnant or going to be having a child, you should store your child's cord blood. But you're already there. You're already in labor. You're having a child. Otherwise, this cord blood is just going to be tossed out. You might as well store the stem cells from it. It's a phenomenal resource. When the three of us on this call, on this podcast, were born, we didn't have that option. It's only been about 18 to 20 years. Is that right, Mark?
Yeah, started the first one, 1998 is when they started, I believe.
In fact, Mark and I were at a party in San Francisco once. We met the oldest person we've ever met that has access to their cord blood. I think that gentleman was 20 years old. So he must have had some very forward-thinking parents. But most people don't have access that are adults to that resource. And so what we do is we pair someone up, and you've done this, so you could speak to it yourself, Chris, but we pair someone up with an orthopedic surgeon or a sports medicine doctor that will pull 60 cc's of bone marrow. It sounds like it's really painful. It's actually quite well tolerated. The procedure itself usually takes about 15 minutes. And the cells that we get from bone marrow are actually remarkably similar to the cell population in cord blood. So for people that didn't have that option when they were born, ForeverLabs exists for them. So it is different in the sense that you're accessing this population of cells from a different source, but you end up with very similar resources later in life to draw upon. Mark, do you want to add to that at all?
Oh, no, I think that's very true. That's it.
Is there a company that is orchestrating the getting stem cells, if I'm saying that right, from newborns? And I guess if my follow-up would be, if let's say that became like de facto default for all the people in America or the world, would that mean that ForeverLabs would kind of be rendered like not as useful in like 80 years, I guess, once everybody had that done?
There's not just one company that's taking cord blood. It's actually quite a mature market. So I think last time I checked, it's around a $3 billion industry in the U.S. Lots of companies providing this service, and there's a lot of consolidation in the space right now. Some of the big players like Cord Blood Registry, CBR. My wife and I had a baby, a little girl named Mila, who's 15 months old now, and we stored her umbilical cord blood. Very simple process. So again, I would highly recommend it. So there are companies do it, lots of them that do it. As far as ForeverLabs becoming sort of moot in 80 years, that may be the case. I don't know, but we have 80 years to find out. The other thing is ForeverLabs is not just a stem cell banking company. And as someone who is a client of ours now, Chris, I think you should be excited to learn that we're also developing approaches that will leverage these cells, not just to treat things like cardiovascular disease, stroke, Alzheimer's, MS. There's lots of people working on that, which is great. But we're really interested in using these cells to stave off age-related disease. What if we can take, young Chris cells and, 10, 15 years from now, start growing them, reintroducing them, not to treat age-related disease, but to prevent it. So these cells build your bone, they support your immune system, build connective tissue. What if we could constantly have right now I'm 41 years old. My stem cells I have banked are 38 years old. By the time I'm 50, I might want to start reintroducing those cells. So we're trying to figure out the best approach for that. We're very conservative in the way we approach this. We don't want to do anything hastily. So we're doing studies right now in mice where we're taking cells from young mice, putting them in genetically matched or syngeneic older mice to start down the path of bringing the first ever clinical trial where our clients can take their younger cells and start reintroducing them for health maintenance measures. So to answer your question about whether or not we're relevant 80 years from now, I think that's what's going to keep us relevant is even if you have your cord blood stored, we'd like to be the company that can be reintroducing it for health maintenance measures. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that really helps. And that brings me to my next question. So I put together a few questions that I had when I was trying to learn about this and that I, dug through or I really bothered you guys with over the past year. I thought I'd kind of condense the top 5 together and maybe, we can kind of, somewhat rapid fire, get through the quick answers on these, like the FAQ
Sure.
to help people who might be thinking these same questions now. So
Sure.
my first question, based on what you were going with was, well, what things can you treat right now? And then what things are coming in the future? Because I think there's you can go down Reddit chats or different chats on the internet, and I think there's it's unclear what's myth and what's actually really happening right now. So can you kind of tell us what can you treat with stem cells right now, and what's the promise in the future? What might we expect?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. So what you can treat right now is you can treat a number of age-related diseases, but in the United States, that's all within the confines of clinical trials. So when I started using these cells in 2001 to treat mice and rats with stroke, there was zero clinical work using these mesenchymal stem cells that are in your bone marrow for the treatment of age-related disease. And so in the last, 18 years now, there's been kind of an explosion, and now there's several hundreds. I mean, actually, if you go with those that are not registered, it's in the thousands treating, from stroke to heart disease and osteoarthritis, MS. There's a laundry list. So basically, if you have a disease that's related to kind of the age-related decline, there's a trial somewhere using MSCs to treat this mesenchymal stem cells to treat it. And some of these are pretty advanced. some of the stroke trials are now in phase 2 and phase 3, which are, phase 3 is the one before they hope to break into the clinic. So they are being used for treatment, but like you said, if you go to Reddit and there's all over like what you can or cannot use them for. So the interesting thing is if you go outside the United States, you can find clinics that are using these cells and they'll stick them in you and try to treat anything. And some of them are based in some, medical or scientific, valid, kind of basis foundation. But some of it is just, quackery. And so there is kind of a large gamut, everything from, a trial for osteoarthritis at the Mayo Clinic, and it's being done in a very, controlled and regulated fashion, and very with a strong scientific kind of like rationale. To you can go somewhere offshore and they'll stick them in your spine to treat I don't know, psoriasis or something, and so it's really it's all over the place, but the legitimate, use is kind of this big, kind of groundswell of applications that are marching forward. And I saw this, and the writing was on the wall for me. I was like, okay, these cells are going to be useful. I don't know exactly what I'm going to use them for, but I do know that I am going to want my youngest ones to be able to, to treat myself with.
I think one thing too to mention, as far as things that are like approved right now in the U.S. to use them for outside of a clinical trial, like if you were to get a blood cancer and you had your cells, your bone marrow derived cells stored, you could potentially use your cells that you have set aside to be your own best donor in that case. Another thing to note is that the regulatory environment is changing pretty quickly. So even just this year, or at the end of last year, we had the right to treat pass in the U.S. So a physician can now determine whether or not an approach is potentially life-saving. So if you have a condition and your physician knows that you have your cells set aside and they deem that your cells could potentially be life-saving, you could use them in that regard. Where the FDA gets really upset, and I think rightfully so, is when these clinics start popping up and they're treating everything with stem cells. Erectile dysfunction, we'll treat it with stem cells. And that, you laugh, but that exists.
Oh, I have no idea.
And so it is sort of the Wild West right now. And, I mentioned earlier that we're quite conservative in our approaches at ForeverLabs, and we're going to remain so. So there's a lot of really promising work being done using these cells. So you set yours aside, Chris. You have them now. They're no longer biologically aging, even though you are. And I'm confident that in the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a number of approved approaches that will allow you to leverage those cells. So part of what you did is you set aside an irreproducible asset that you can draw upon when the regulatory environment in the U.S. catches up. If for whatever reason it doesn't, as Mark mentioned, there are no shortage of places outside of the U.S. that are already using these cells. Some of them with a lot of integrity, others not so much so. So be careful, people.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So I guess that brings me to my next question, which would be like, how do I know when to bank my cells? Like I have them done now. You're mentioning anything from our osteoporosis, erectile dysfunction. How do I go, hey, this is something, I have a headache, this is something I should treat with stem cells?
Yeah, well, I think I get this question a lot, like how should I use them? When am I going to use them? And it sounded like you had a lot of questions over the last year. I want to give a shout out to Kelly Borg, who I think is our client liaison here that dealt with you for the last year. So well done, Kelly. I give the same advice to everyone. A lot of people are looking to go outside of the U.S. to have stem cell treatments, and there are two things I suggest. Number one, just first of all, you should ask your physician. Make sure that the physician that is going to apply these approaches to you is working in their chosen field. So what I find all the time are people that are offering stem cell treatments for X, Y, and Z, and they're a chiropractor, or they have nothing to do with the field of use where these cells are being administered. So work with a doctor that is in their chosen specialty, and take a look at where that doctor trained. These things matter. Look at where the physician hails from. At ForeverLabs, our doctors hail from Harvard, Stanford, Duke, Michigan. These are great doctors. So my advice, if you've got a headache, it's probably not when you want to draw upon your cells. But if you had a more serious indication, you should certainly let your physician know that you have this resource set aside. It could very well be beneficial to you. I think a better question is how do we plan to use ours, right? So Mark and I have our cells set aside, and they're now 3 years younger than we are. And I want to use mine. I hopefully don't have to use it if I have a stroke. I don't want to have a stroke. I don't want to get cardiovascular disease. I want to start using mine for health maintenance measures, but I need to wait till the cells that are in my body are markedly older than the ones that I've set aside. If I start reintroducing these cells now, they're only 3 years younger than I am. They're probably not so different from what's still inside of me, but as we start approaching 10 years out, I start getting a little bit more interested in that. So for me, that's how I plan to use them. Mark, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would like just to add that I think that, it's difficult to know how you use them today, but every year it becomes less difficult because there's just a tremendous amount of work being done with these cells. And so it's getting a little bit clearer, and where they're, they might be most applicable first. It looks like something like stroke and MS actually are really promising. Osteoarthritis are also, and I think it's attributed to Bill Gates, who said something like we underestimate how fast, or we overestimate how fast things develop, technology develops in the short term, but we underestimate how fast it develops in the long term. And there's been kind of like an exponential kind of growth in these trials and in the use of these cells. And so I think it's going to be, 10 years from now, it's going to be very clear. There's going to, how they're used. And that's really, what motivated me. What's funny is because people often want to know, obviously, like, how are we going to use them? And it's a difficult question to answer because everybody's different and we don't know, the rate at which this application or this application will develop and which ones are going to come to, the clinic first. But the one thing that we do know for certain is that between now and then, you're going to grow older, and so are your stem cells. And so the one thing we can do between now and then is we can stop that and we can bank them. And so when that time comes and you do know for certain what you're going to use them for, you're going to have the youngest cells.
Amazing. So you guys have only been in business for, you started 3 years ago, so it's still a new company. Has anyone unbanked their cells? Has anyone taken their...
I like that term, unbanked. Yeah,
unbanked.
No. Yeah, we've had people that have requested their cells for several different reasons. I think one person was or two of them were in the sciences themselves, and I think they really just wanted to take a look at their own cells and work upon them. We've had people that have sent their cells to places where they can use them therapeutically too. So the stem cells belong to you. Your cells that you have stored with ForeverLabs, Chris, those are yours. We will send them anywhere in the world for you. So, but the application on the other side of that's between you and the physician that you're working with. But yeah, people have.
I have not unbanked mine.
Yeah, mine are spanked. Yeah.
Cool. Me too. Sweet. And I think the final thing I was wondering is, I'd heard of people donating their bone marrow or stem cells. I think there's even a whole Radiolab episode about it. And I was just wondering, is that kind of the same thing, or is there an opportunity to share them, or if I die, pass them on, and can other people even use my stem cells? Are they useful? Because I feel like there's this Warby Parker. Yeah, I buy glasses, and somebody in a developing country gets a free pair of glasses. If I get my stem cells taken, does someone get something that's helpful to them also? Is that a thing? I'm making that up, but is that a thing?
Well, kind of. So really the whole value of ForeverLabs is that these are your cells, right? And donor cells can be advantageous for someone else, but not to the degree that autologous or your own cells are. But really where your cells could help is in research. And we are actually just developing this where I should say by default, nobody's cells go anywhere. So they stay at ForeverLabs. We set aside a small amount of everyone's, including mine and Mark's and yours, for quality assurance purposes. We'll set aside a small little microaliquot of every single sample that comes through. Once we do any quality assurance on that, we typically just toss it out. But it could go to research to help accelerate stem cell research. So we are starting to enable our clients to opt in to that. So if they're interested in taking that small, we call it a microaliquot of cells, instead of discarding it, they can opt to consent to donate it to research. So at ForeverLabs, one of the things we're most interested in is accelerating all of the research being done, not just our own, but other people that are working in the space too. So that's one way that we can do it. We are starting to go down the path of looking at whether or not we can determine someone can join the registry, the bone marrow registry, too, because we've had so many clients ask us about it. So that's one thing that's on our roadmap as well. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yeah, and the bone marrow registry that's people who are looking for bone marrow, and then they could join like a wait list, I guess, for future.
Yeah, so people that need to have a transplant. I mean, it's incredibly sad and difficult. There's you go out there, you're looking for someone who's a match, an HLA match. But even when they find someone who's a match, and it's oftentimes it's a family member, but it's not always the case. It could be someone else that's a match. Even when there's a match, there is a very high rejection rate. So again, one of the reasons your own biology matters so much. So while you're young and healthy, like, set these things aside.
Cool. This is great. I want to switch I guess, conversation a little bit to talking about education in this field, and specifically around just some books that may have influenced you to end up in this field, or that people listening can maybe read to follow up on. I had mentioned to you earlier that one of the things that I found tricky, I guess how I learn, like just my pattern of framework of learning, is when I don't know something, I tend to talk to people who are smarter than me. I tend to grab a book on it, watch a documentary, just go down Wikipedia holes, like whatever it is. I feel like I attack it from a lot of different angles. And I was really surprised that it seemed like there was a lot of my friends who had, that live in Silicon Valley and that were part of Y Combinator seemed to have a lot to say about it. And there was a lot on the internet about it, but I couldn't find any books, and I couldn't find, I don't even know. I mean, aside from Mark, I know you have a Google talk. I watched that, but aside from that, there wasn't too many things online. It was really surprising to me. So I just want to shift gears and ask you, after this interview, how does someone go and learn more about this field? Are there any books or any top thinkers in the space that we can learn from?
Yeah.
Well, no, I was just going to say, no, I think you should definitely take this. But when we first started the company, we went to, it was a conference in San Francisco at the Buck Institute. Do you remember what that was called, Mark?
It was a SENS conference.
And it was so Aubrey de Grey's group, SENS. And after that, Mark, you were the one that suggested I read Ending Aging by Aubrey de Grey. And I've since bought that as a gift for like a number of people, my dad, people that are interested in learning more about longevity, in the pursuit of longevity. So for me, I think that is a great starting point. And I also think anyone that's looking into this space and looking into learning more about the whole longevity space, I think Aubrey de Grey and just his talks, he has so many of them online that you could watch. So I think that's probably a good start. And I think he's been paramount in making ending aging, like combating death itself, something that isn't crazy, right? I think maybe even now, people, when I tell them what we're trying to do, they think it's sacrilege. It's amazing to me that how people can be so upset that we're trying to combat aging as a problem. And I think Aubrey is a great starting point for people that are new to this as a pursuit that is worthwhile. So I think ending aging.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I remember seeing his TED Talk. I think it was from like 2005 or 6 or something. And yeah, I think he has some, I guess his thesis from what I remember, and maybe you can help me understand this a little bit more, is just that, we can combat or reverse human aging in our lifetime, something like to that extent. Is his main argument about stem cells, or is it about just a lot of different parts of aging?
Yeah, Mark, you can speak to this better than I could.
So I would say, if you're interested in this space, the one book you absolutely must read is Aubrey de Grey's Ending Aging, because Aubrey he's a champion for the cause and the notion that aging is actually, a disease itself, or is aging is something that we can actually treat. Like many diseases that we think are diseases are actually just aging. And the not only is he a champion and really, kind of persuasive and tireless, but Aubrey is brilliant. He he made a very significant contribution in this book, because what he did is he basically looked at aging and said, okay, let's create a framework and let's try to understand what is aging, and if we were going to try to solve it as a problem, how would we break down this problem into its component parts? And in the book, he lays out 7 categories of kind of damage that occur during the aging process. And his hypothesis in the book is, if we can treat these 7 kinds of damage faster than they occur, then what we could actually do is end aging. And it stood up extremely well. I mean, even to today, I don't think anybody's been able to throw up, the 8th or take or remove one of these, different kinds. And so stem cells actually is one of it. It's actually the first one he lists in the book, I think. It's the loss of stem cells, and so replacing stem cells is one of them. Other ones are, you've got mutations in the DNA. You've got cellular senescence, which is like the cells turning off and as they become damaged. You have mitochondrial mutations. Protein cross-linking was one, and then a couple that have to do with garbage kind of buildup in your biology. So ending aging is really good, because it kind of, Aubrey, and I agree with this wholeheartedly. Actually, I'm a medical physicist by training, but what Aubrey often says is that this is a physics problem, not a biology problem. It's a biological problem, it's a biological system, but the breakdown is actually a physical phenomenon. And so as our understanding of it and our ability to interact with our own biology is improved, we're able to actually start, intervening in these, common factors that lead to an age-related decline. I kind of, if you did see my Google talk, I kind of point out that, the onset of age-related disease, it starts occurring in middle age, and it kind of exponentially goes up from there. And if you look at the decline, age-related decline, and on a cellular level, in almost any of these, the curve goes exactly the opposite direction, almost exactly the opposite rate. Like, there's a dysfunction at the cellular level, which leads to, that leads to a dysfunction at the, tissue level and systemic level, and then you end up with these age-related, catastrophes. And so I think Aubrey does a really good job, I think, of laying that out. And if anybody, if there's a book to read, it would be Ending Aging.
I love it. That's really helpful. We're gonna wrap up right now, and just last question to both of you. I mean, this is a books podcast. We all love talking about books, and the Aubrey de Grey book seems like perfect. I have not read it, so I'm really excited. I didn't actually even know what to think of him a little bit, because I was just like, I had seen the TED Talk a long time ago, so it's cool to know that this kind of fits into the larger story of how you guys are thinking, and so I'm super excited to read that. But turning things to you guys, last question is just, what book has been the most influential to you in your life? And it can have to do with your journey to ForeverLabs, or just in life in general. What's been the most influential to you?
Well, I had a dog named Hemingway, if that says anything. But, for me, as far as my career goes, if it's not evident by our time spent together just now, Mark handles the lab and the science behind ForeverLabs. I tend to handle the business development aspects, do a lot of hiring and business development in regards to bringing on physicians and growing our physician network, et cetera. And so one book that's helped me in that regard quite a bit is by a guy named Dan Pink. It's called Drive, and you may be familiar with it, but it basically, the hypothesis is that high pay doesn't necessarily, and like bonuses, they don't necessarily motivate people for high performance. People basically want to have enough money to make sure that they're doing okay and don't have to worry about money. But what really motivates people is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I reference this a lot. So like anyone that I've hired at ForeverLabs, they've heard me talk about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So autonomy in the sense that people, they want to be self-directed, be able to create their own path towards whatever objective they have in front of them. Mastery in the sense that they want to better themselves and want to be able to have resources from their company in order to do that. And then purpose, finding meaning in what they do on a day-to-day basis, and being able to have a positive impact. So I think we have all those things at ForeverLabs. The last one, purpose. I mean, if you can't find purpose in what we're doing at ForeverLabs, there's something wrong with you. So that book, to me, I would recommend any like budding entrepreneur, anyone that's in a leadership role. I think it's a pretty fantastic book. But on top of that, A Farewell to Arms is the best book ever written, in my opinion. So, but I'm sure plenty has been said about that in the past. So those would be my choices.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, Mark, what do you think? I'd love to hear.
Yeah, so it very difficult to pick one. One book that I can say that was pivotal. It made a big difference to me. It was Baroka's Brain by Carl Sagan, and it's like the subtitle I think is Reflections on the Romance of Science. And my original goal, my original like path was art school. I spent most of my high school years in art classes, but always was reading a lot of science and whatnot. And when parents wouldn't send me to art school, I decided that, physics was the next best thing. And that's led me here. But there was a summer that I was, around that time where I was figuring that I might not be an artist. And it just really, like, Carl Sagan was just an amazing person because he kind of could show why scientists do what they do. And that's so much not, just analytics, and it's not just it's about, uncovering and discovering ground that nobody's ever tread on, and that there's just this like passion and romance behind this, and it really, I think, kind of invigorated me and kind of set me off on the course of being somebody that, could find a lot of, I don't know. I mean, it's just there's nothing like a good experiment, like an experiment when you're like, holy cow. It's just, there's nothing like it. And so, yeah, Baroka's Brain. But I'm going to cheat and just say another book too is a book that's really powerfully influenced me and has nothing to do with science at all. Is actually Barbara Tuchman. She wrote, it's called The Guns of August. And Barbara Tuchman was a self-trained historian, and she won the Pulitzer for Guns of August. And the book, it's about the kind of the beginning of World War I, the lead up to World War I. And it's just this, like amazing kind of, like storytelling, and just like, she just kind of lays out, there's this crazy, like all these different moving parts of the world stage, and how we just kind of stumbled into this, catastrophe, which kind of, we're still like, I think, as our world, like as a culture, we're still like in PTSD from World War I. And I think, history rhymes. And I think that that book resonated with me. It's just so interesting to see how could humanity, do like things like, fall into things like that. And she, I've read that JFK had everybody in his administration read it during the Bay of Pigs.
Really?
Yeah. Because it's just really illuminating. She was a masterful historian. And then I read every other book she wrote after that. But yeah, Guns of August.
As Guns of August, does it take place? Is there like a central? Is it like take place in DC, or is it like a view of the Americans, or is it kind of like more like a sweeping?
Oh, it's Europe. It's
all of Europe.
It's looking at Europe, Europe, and like kind of like European and kind kind of political, like the politics and and why this happened, and kind of, it's just kind of crazy. It's just kind of crazy. I'm sorry, I'm going to say another. In Tolstoy. So if you read my Penguin edition of War and Peace, at the end of it, Tolstoy spends some time talking about, so the War and Peace, obviously, it's the Napoleonic. It occurs during the Napoleonic invasion of Russia, and at the end of that, he just writes this essay of was this because of Napoleon, or was this Napoleon just riding a wave that was going to happen anyway? Was this inevitable? I think that's a really interesting question for just humanity in general. What are the things that we can determine, and what are things that are inevitable? Global warming, things like that, things that we face, and we're are these things that we can determine, or are we just, riding it? She kind of, so anyway, Guns of August kind of looks at that and did World War I happen because we made it happen? Because, Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, or did it happen because we couldn't stop it, Anyway.
Oh, yeah, no, that's great. There's a hardcore history. I don't know if you've heard that podcast, and where he pulls that apart. It's amazing. It's a great question. Yeah. Was it meant to happen, or I guess what things can we change as well, and what things must we accept, I guess, is also what that makes me think about.
Back on the longevity front, sorry, just a tail end to that, dovetail it, is that people often ask me, they're should we even do this? Should we even make people live longer if we can? And I think it's kind of crazy, because we've been doing that since, we've existed. We've, vaccines, we make people live longer and healthier, sterile technique and things. We've always are practicing these ways, good,
tourniquets.
Good, good hygiene, just, sewer systems. We're always doing things to improve human health. And it's just, we're going to do everything we can to improve, healthy lifespan. And so what we need to, the I think more interesting question is, well, when people do start living longer, how is that going to change things, and how should we plan for that? And can we, make the best of that? So anyway, I think longevity is one of those things that is kind of an eventuality, but it's going to be, transformative for our culture and for, humanity.
I love it. That's great. Well, this is amazing. Thank you two for being on the podcast. I'm going to direct people to ForeverLabs.com if they want to find out more about Forever Labs. Is there any other place that they should look? I'll also put all the links to the books and any of the sites that we mentioned during the podcast. This will be on YouTube, and this will be in the iTunes. We have the podcast, so I'll put all that there. Is there anything else I should add to that? Is there any place that people should go to find out more?
I think that's great.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, Chris.
All right, well, thanks, you guys,
Chris.
so much
Great
for
time.
being on the podcast.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Pleasure.
All right, thanks for listening to the On Books podcast. If you would like to listen to more episodes of this podcast, you can get it on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube. It's all over the place. I also launched my new Learn to Code podcast. Learn to Code in 1 month is the full name. It's a blue icon, little calendar. You can subscribe and hear more stories of me interviewing people who have learned to code and are doing amazing things, not only as developers, but also just a range of different professions where knowing code and knowing the basics of digital literacy is really helping people upskill and do amazing things on the job. So I hope you check that out. You can get it by searching Learn to Code. It's by 1 month and me, or by going to onemonth.com, clicking on the blog, and you will find all of the notes, transcripts, links, and all of that for free. Also, that is also on iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, Spotify, everywhere. Check it out. If you have any questions for me, you can reach me. I'm Chris at on-books.com. You can also write me, on Twitter. I'm at Castig, that's Castig. Or if you want to write me about the Learn to Code podcast, that's at 1month.edu. It's at 1month.edu.